After being away for 4 days, I returned to discover the sole bridge providing access to my property had been sealed with heavy chains, their anchors drilled directly into the concrete surface, bearing the Homeowners Association emblem as though they had claimed victory over territory that belonged to me, and that discovery was merely the beginning because I subsequently uncovered surveillance devices concealed in the surrounding area, falsified property boundary documentation, and a fraudulent structural safety decree bearing the signature of an engineer whose professional credentials had been stripped away following conviction for deceptive practices. And in that moment, the reality became crystal clear that what I faced wasn't simply a neighborhood governance disagreement, but rather a calculated attempt at seizing control, and those responsible remained completely unaware they had just provoked someone who wouldn't surrender without an epic confrontation. The Montana mountain wilderness possesses a distinctive tranquility that the vast majority of individuals never experience throughout their existence, and this phenomenon differs entirely from mere absence of sound because silence represents emptiness, whereas this represents something entirely different, specifically the acoustic signature of nature, finding equilibrium, manifesting through the soft rustling of pine needles suspended high above the flowing waterway, the deep resonance of liquid moving across stone surfaces, and the subtle creaking of aged wooden structures responding to frigid morning temperatures, and that particular quality of stillness represented everything that drew me to purchase this property and motivated me to construct my dwelling using nothing but my own labor, advancing one plank at a time, one earnings payment at a time, throughout one extended and determined 12-month period after another, and throughout 18 consecutive years, absolutely nobody interfered with my life, nobody challenged the legitimacy of my bridge structure, nobody attempted to assert ownership over the soil supporting my footsteps, but everything transformed on that particular morning after I'd been absent for 4 days, merely 4, during which time I visited a longtime companion, replenished necessary provisions, and engaged in the type of meaningful dialogue only possible with someone who knew you before your facial hair transitioned to gray coloration, and upon driving back along the unpaved roadway and exiting my vehicle, something felt fundamentally wrong in the atmosphere, the air carrying a cold, sharp, metallic quality, an aroma one never wants to detect near concrete installations, specifically freshly severed steel. And I advanced slowly forward with my boots breaking through the surface frost layer until the chains came into view. Massive black chains stretched taut across the entrance to my bridge structure, secured directly into the cool, increte foundation as though someone had claimed possession during the darkness of night, with a bright aluminum placard suspended from the center declaring Homeowners Association property with access privileges revoked, and my breath escaped me, not from fear or panic, but from profound incredulity, because I had never been affiliated with any homeowners association, never had been, and never intended to be, given that my land sat 2 miles north of the nearest residential development, far removed from their meticulously manicured lawns and golf cart pathways. Yet here they stood, planting their symbolic flag as though they had discovered uncharted territory, and I crouched beside the restraints, touched the bolt head, which remained warm, indicating whoever executed this action hadn't departed long ago, and I scanned the tree line on instinct because years of solitary living teach you to identify elements that don't belong in the natural environment, which is when the glinting reflection captured my attention, a tiny light reflection emanating from within a cluster of brush, and upon pushing the branch aside, I discovered a camera, a small black square device aimed directly at my bridge, connected to a battery pack concealed beneath dead foliage, and that was the moment when the tranquility transformed because it no longer felt peaceful but rather surveilled, and I rose to my feet with jaw clenched tight and stared at the river flowing quietly beneath the blocked passage and spoke under my breath that this isn't a mistake but rather a calculated maneuver, and my truck couldn't traverse the obstruction with chains pulled so tightly they could halt a military tank. So I reversed up the dirt road, parked on the opposite side, and took the extended trail through the wooded area, and while the hike wasn't particularly challenging, the burden of anger made every step feel heavier, and by the time I reached my porch, the Montana atmosphere felt thinner as though the land, itself sensed something had gone terribly wrong, and inside, I removed my coat, kicked off the cold, and poured a cup of coffee while the house felt different, not unsafe exactly, but disturbed, as if someone had knocked something out of alignment deep within its foundation, and on the kitchen table sat the envelope I had discovered earlier in my mailbox, plain and cheap with no postal stamp and no courtesy, just a printed accusation regarding boundary reassessment and unauthorized land usage with payment required, and I had encountered inadequate paperwork previously, but this particular document read like a threat composed by someone who had never encountered a legitimate attorney in their life, yet I'm a reasonable man who believes in beginning with truth before engaging with falsehoods, so I dialed the telephone number printed at the bottom, and it rang only twice before a voice answered identifying themselves as Riverside Tranquility Homeowners Association, with Karen speaking, and I closed my eyes for half a second because of course her name was Karen, and I addressed her as ma'am and stated my name is Garrett Kane, and I received a notice claiming my bridge encroaches on Homeowners Association land and I'm calling to resolve what I'm confident is a misunderstanding, but her voice sharpened instantly, declaring there is no misunderstanding, Mr. Kane, because according to their updated boundary assessment, my structure is partially within Riverside Tranquility jurisdiction, and I glanced out the window at the river, which had marked my property line since the day I purchased the place and stated my bridge is on my land, having been surveyed and stamped and inspected and approved, and your jurisdiction ends 2 miles south, but there was a pause, not the kind where someone considers what you're saying, but rather the kind where they prepare something smug, and she replied that their maps supersede outdated documents, and if I wish to dispute the charges, I may do so through appropriate legal channels, but the board has voted and the fees stand, and I requested to see those maps, but she stated they don't release internal assessments to non-members, meaning me, meaning the man whose bridge they had just chained shut, and I felt something settle in me then, slow and heavy and inevitable like the first click of a storm door caught in the wind, and I said quietly that all right, if that's the game you want to play, then we'll play. And her voice brightened like she was offering a coupon at a grocery store saying payment is due within 10 days and have a wonderful afternoon. And she disconnected just like that with no conversation, no courtesy, no proof, only entitlement and the echo of a woman who had absolutely no idea what kind of fight she had just initiated. And I've learned something over the years, that when people lie, they rarely execute it cleanly because there's always a wrinkle or smudge or corner peeling up where truth tries to escape, and the Homeowners Association letter had plenty of peeling corners. So I brought the papers to my desk and sat in the old leather chair that had outlived 2 states and a wildfire and laid everything out flat. And the boundary reassessment was laughable, missing every legal requirement a legitimate survey needs. But the attached map was the part that made the coffee in my stomach turn sour with its glossy print and thick red marking over my bridge and property lines, bent like someone drew them during a seizure, and a faint gray caption reading Homeowners Association Zone Revised Expansion Overlay. And there was that word again, expansion. But something stranger emerged because the coordinate grid didn't match rural mapping standards, and the watermark was stretched, and the survey seal was the wrong shape entirely, meaning someone hadn't just made a mistake but had fabricated evidence. And I sat back and exhaled through my teeth before another thought struck me regarding the camera, because in the moment I found it earlier, my brain was too occupied processing the shock of the chained bridge and the audacity of the sign and the sense of violation, and I hadn't examined the ground because I'd been too focused on that glinting lens tucked in the brush. But now I wanted evidence, so I grabbed my coat and stepped outside and followed the trail down to where the little device had been hiding, and the forest was quiet in a way that means every creature within 50 yards is listening, and I crouched and reached under the dead leaves and pulled the camera free, noting it was weatherproof with night vision and motion-triggered meaning. Someone hadn't just wanted to see the bridge, but wanted to see me at the bridge. And I turned the camera over in my hand, feeling its cold weight when I finally looked down to discover fresh footprints, specifically boot prints size 10 or 11 with deep tread belonging to someone heavier than me, or at least not trying to walk lightly, and I followed the impressions with my eyes as they led from the roadside straight to the brush where the camera had been nestled, and the dirt was still damp with the edges of the print, still sharp, meaning whoever planted the device had done it recently within hours or maybe less, and a slow burn started behind my ribs. Not panic or rage, but resolve, cold and steady old man resolve. And I pocketed the camera and stood up looking across the valley where the roofs of Riverside Tranquility gleamed in the distance, all the same color and angles and personality, like little toy boxes stacked in rows. And somewhere among them was a person who thought they could push a man off his own land with nothing more than paper lies and a padlock. And they were about to learn how profoundly wrong they were. So I turned away from the river and climbed the trail back home, where the air felt heavier, now as if the valley itself was bracing for something. And inside the house, I set the forged map on the table and peeked, laced the camera beside it, and pulled the memory card out with a quiet click, because whatever was stored on this device could be the difference between suspicion and proof. But before I checked it, the caption at the bottom of the map caught my eye, again stating expansion overlay, meaning there was another document this was based on. Probably something internal, probably something they didn't want outsiders seeing, probably something stupid enough that someone had leaked it somewhere on the internet, because homeowners association boards love making document files they shouldn't. So I powered on my computer and cracked my knuckles and muttered, "Let's see exactly what you idiots are planning to lay over my land." And as the screen illuminated my desk in cold blue light, the war officially began. And there's a funny thing about homeowners associations in that they love paperwork and meetings and reports, and most of all, they love saving everything in portable document format, which also means they love leaking things by accident. So I type Riverside Tranquility Homeowners Association overlay expansion into the search bar, half expecting nothing more than a bunch of gardening newsletters and passive-aggressive meeting notes. But 3 links down, I found something that made my eyebrows pull together, specifically a file on a community cloud drive that was public with no password, just sitting there like a trap someone forgot to hide, labeled Riverside Tranquility Phase 2 Planning Draft Portable Document Format, and draft meaning, not final meaning, someone uploaded it early, meaning someone out there had no idea what they had just given me. So I clicked, and the document opened in all its self-important glory with 23 pages of corporate fonts and stock photos of smiling families and phrases like future community integration, corridor and river adjacency, optimization and shared access improvement initiative. And you could smell the consultants through the screen. Oh, ewy. And I scrolled down to the maps, and there it was with my land and my river bend and my bridge sitting directly across a dashed red arrow labeled Preferred Northern Access Route Phase 2. And I leaned in closer with jaw tightening because the arrow pointed straight to the site of my bridge, not near it or adjacent, but straight to it. And the plan notes read, current conditions, no established community access route with potential obstacle being private bridge owned by non-member landholder. And there I was labeled as an obstacle. And below that came recommendation for jurisdiction claim via boundary reassessment to secure northern ingress. And there it was the smoking gun, because this wasn't a misunderstanding or an overreach or some overeager homeowners association president misreading a map, but rather a strategy laid out like a blueprint for a burglary. And I scrolled further to discover a small section near the bottom that had been highlighted perhaps by the last person who handled the file, stating projected benefits of northern access, including reduced drive time for residents and emergency response shortcuts, and connection to regional road system and expansion viability of lots 51 through 66, meaning new homes and new money. And to build them, they needed an entrance they could never afford to construct themselves, but one that already existed on my land, specifically my bridge. And I sat back in my chair with the leather creaking under the shift of my weight and muttered, well, there's your motive. And the file had dates and signatures and drafts and revision history, proving these weren't Karen's pet fantasies, but rather a coordinated homeowners association initiative. And right there in the revision notes appeared legal counsel recommends asserting claim over riparian buffer zone for jurisdiction, expansion with riparian meaning, riverbank meaning, the thin strip of unassigned buffer land between my property and theirs, meaning they were counting on confusion, but what they didn't know was this, that I built my bridge with certified boundaries and walked the land with surveyors and pored over plat maps until I could draw them from memory, making me the worst possible landowner to target, specifically a man who knew the paperwork better than they did. So I downloaded the entire Phase 2 file and saved it twice and copied it to an external drive, then printed the important pages and laid them out on my desk beside the forged homeowners association map, creating 2 plans side by side with one fabricated and one leaked. And funny thing, they matched just enough to incriminate everyone involved. And I whispered, they want access and they think they'll take it, but no, not from me, not today, not ever. And I reached for my phone and dialed my lawyer in Missoula, and when Mitchell answered, I said, we've got ourselves a project, and I woke before sunrise the next morning with a knot in my stomach, not from fear, but just the instinct a man earns after enough years dealing with people who smile while hiding the knife behind their back. And I brewed a cup of coffee and stepped outside and followed the trail toward the river, where the air was colder than usual, sharp enough to sting with the kind of cold that keeps a man awake even when he wishes this was all just a bad dream. And when the trees finally opened and the bridge came into view, I stopped dead in my tracks because it wasn't just the chains anymore, as they had escalated with a full steel barricade standing across the mouth of my bridge, featuring 4-inch posts drilled deep into the concrete and braced with galvanized bars and wrapped 3 times with heavy industrial chain, all locked with a padlock the size of a baby's fist, and a brand new sign dangled in the middle declaring emergency safety closure due to structural instability detected and authorized by engineer Leonard Briggs. And Briggs was a name that meant nothing then, but soon I would learn he wasn't an engineer at all. Not anymore, not legally, but in that moment, he was the man whose forged signature had cut me off from the rest of the world. And I set my coffee on a rock and stepped closer, laying my palm on the steel, which was freezing cold enough to bite my skin, with the kind of cold that said this barricade had been installed under cover of darkness, left to sit through the long night like a sentinel, with no pulse and no warmth and no humanity, just a declaration that you're not going anywhere, and a slow, steady breath pushed out of me. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of quiet disbelief that sinks deep and stays heavy, because this wasn't vandalism, but rather a deliberate blockade, a calculated move meant to isolate me and trap me on my own land and make me bend. But I don't bend not for people, and sure as hell not for paperwork bullies with clipboards. So I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's office, and Deputy Thurman arrived 25 minutes later, a young man who was polite and the kind who still believes disputes can be solved with reason and calm conversation. And he took one look at the barricade and let out a low whistle, asking if that was mine, and I said no, but everything behind it is. And I handed him my paperwork, including permits and county surveys and engineering approvals, the whole stack, and he read through them, nodding slowly, and stated, well, this all looks solid as you did everything by the book. And I said, then cut the chain, but he hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything, because he stated, he can't do that, Mr. Kane. And I asked why not, given this is my bridge on my land, and he pointed at the sign stating, because we received that order too regarding emergency safety closure, and if I cut this and that bridge collapses, the liability comes down on the department. And I asked if he really thought my bridge was unstable, and he said gently, that's not the issue, as the issue is a certified engineer signed that C. Lusher. And I almost laughed, because later I would learn Briggs had lost his license 5 years ago for falsifying soil reports, but for now, all Deputy Thurman had to go on was a printed piece of paper with a forged stamp, and he looked genuinely conflicted and said softly to file for an injunction, as it's your best route, and until then my hands are tied. And I nodded, because it wasn't his fault, as he had been handed a stack of lies dressed up as authority, and he headed back to his cruiser, but I didn't, as I took the long way home via the steep game trail, crawling up the backside of my property with roots slick from frost and rocks hidden under old leaves, and halfway up my boot slipped, and my knee slammed into a jagged stone so hard stars burst behind my eyes, and I cursed out loud at the ground and the homeowners association and the universe, then pushed myself upright and limped the rest of the way. And by the time my porch came into view, the pain had turned into a slow, angry throb, and that throbbing would later become part of my medical file representing documented injury and another nail in the homeowners association coffin. And I looked back toward the river, where through the trees I could just make out the silver barricade glinting like a taunt in the rising sun, because they hadn't just blocked my bridge, but had endangered my life, and that crossed a line. So I took a deep breath, slow and steady and controlled, then said what I knew to be true, that it's time to fight back, and what I didn't know yet was just how far they were willing to go, or how much evidence they had already left for me to use against them. And pain has a strange way of sharpening the mind, because by the time I limped into my living room and lowered myself into a chair, my knee had swollen enough to press against the denim of my jeans with throbbing that wasn't subtle, but rather the deep, deliberate kind that pulses with each heartbeat, reminding you of the moment everything went wrong. But this time, the pain wasn't just inconvenience, but was evidence. So I grabbed my truck keys and walked the long trail back around the backside of my property, slow and steady with one careful step at a time, and finally reached the road where my truck still sat. And every step hurt, but every step also hardened something inside me, because if Karen wanted a paper war, she would get one and she would lose. And at the clinic in town, the nurse asked how I had hurt myself, and I didn't sugarcoat it, stating I slipped on a frost-covered game trail because my only legal access home was blocked by an illegal barricade, and the doctor documented everything, including contusion and swelling and range of motion restriction, and he asked if I wanted radiographs, and I said yes, because it never hurts to have too much proof. And I left with a brace and 2 prescriptions and a stack of medical records thick enough to make any lawyer smile. And back in the truck, I dialed the number that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since the moment I saw that barricade, specifically Mitchell Harper, attorney, who is smart and steady and ruthless when necessary. And he answered on the second ring saying, "Garrett, it's been a while." And I said, "I wish this was a friendly call." And he responded, "I'm guessing it's not so. What happened?" And I laid everything out, including the chains and the forged safety order and the fake engineer and the new barricade and my fall and my injury. But when I told him about the expansion map I had found marking my bridge as a preferred access corridor, Mitchell's tone changed, and he instructed me to send all of it, including photos and maps and medical records. And he added, "Garrett, don't talk to them, not until we move first." So I hung up and drove straight to Bozeman and walked into the Global Positioning System Surveying Office, which is one of the only places in the state capable of producing sub-inch accuracy legal boundary scans. And the technician recognized me, immediately asking if I was the guy who built that concrete span over Black Row, and I confirmed, "That's me, and it's still standing strong," and he said it is. But the only problem is a group of neighbors who say it isn't. And he chuckled under his breath, stating that sounds like a problem they made up, and I said, "I'm starting to think so too." So I booked the earliest field survey scheduled 2 days out, where they would scan the whole property line, including riverbank and bridge piers, creating a legal certified map that nobody, not even a homeowners association with a taste for fiction, could argue with. And when I got home, I limped into my office and braced myself in the chair and laid everything out across my desk, including medical forms and forged maps and photos of the barricade and the original homeowners association threat letter and the memory card from the hidden camera I had pulled off the railing. And I slid the card into my computer, where the files loaded slowly one after another with short clips that were motion triggered and mostly empty frames of river and wind. But 2 caught my attention, and the first wasn't clear, but it told me plenty, because the camera had been switched on before it was fully mounted, and for a few seconds the lens swung wildly, catching quick flashes of a reflective vest and a gloved hand and the edge of a tool pouch with no face. Never that, but enough to prove someone had been on my land, deliberately setting it up. And even better, I heard a voice, low and muffled, saying, "Hold it steady right here." And the second clip showed silhouettes installing the barricade, with blurry shapes moving with purpose, hauling metal and tightening chains, providing enough to identify tools and enough to match footwear tread later. and enough to show intent, and I leaned back slowly, exhaling through my nose because this wasn't some petty homeowners association complaint about grass length or mailbox color, but rather trespassing and criminal interference and fraud, and a coordinated attempt to force access across my land, and they thought I would fold, and they thought an older man living alone near a river would rather comply than fight, but they thought wrong. So I organized every document and every photo and every time-stamped file into a single binder representing my case and my ammunition. Then I closed the cover and set it gently on the desk and let the weight settle into my hands, because tomorrow the counterattack would begin. But tonight I prepared because war wasn't coming, as it was already here, and 2 days passed without a knock and without a phone call and without a fresh envelope stuffed with bad ideas, and that alone made me suspicious, because silence, I've learned, is never peace but rather preparation. And sure enough, on the morning the survey team was set to arrive, a new envelope showed up in my mailbox, not from the Homeowners Association, this time with no smug logo and no cheap printer ink, but rather from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, which got my attention. So I tore it open right there on the porch, with knees still stiff and coffee still hot and breath fogging in the cold air. And the letter was polite in that uniquely bureaucratic way, with courteous font and firm language stating a complaint has been filed, alleging that support columns of your bridge may obstruct seasonal aquatic migration patterns, and translation meant someone complained about fish specifically, someone meaning the Homeowners Association, meaning Karen. And I kept reading, where it stated an environmental field team will conduct a preliminary inspection within 10 business days, and please ensure access to the site, with non-compliance potentially resulting in further action. And I lowered the letter and muttered, of course, because when land grabs fail, bring in the salmon. And I wasn't worried about my bridge as it was designed, with flow rates and sediment patterns and wildlife in mind, but I wasn't about to trust the state team walking in blind to a Homeowners Association manufactured narrative. So I dialed a number I hadn't used in years, specifically Montana State University Department of Aquatic Biology, where a receptionist picked up, and I asked if Professor Claire Mendoza was available. And there was a pause before a familiar voice came on saying, "This is Claire." And I stated, "It's Garrett Kane from Black Row River." And she didn't respond for a moment before finally asking, "What's going on?" So I explained the fake land claim and the forged maps and the barricade and the injury, and now the new accusation that my bridge was somehow a threat to fish. And Claire let out a long, unimpressed breath saying, "Garrett, the span of that river beneath your bridge has one of the most stable flow pockets in the county." And she asked who filed the complaint, and I said anonymous, and she snapped, "Oh, please, it's the Homeowners Association, isn't it?" And I stated I would bet my truck on it, and she said, "All right, I'll come out." And I asked if she was sure, and she responded, "Are you telling me someone's falsely weaponizing aquatic law against you, because that's my field, and I'm not letting bad science or bad neighbors win?" And 2 days later, she arrived in a dusty university truck with 2 graduate students and enough equipment to run a full-scale field study, including waders and underwater cameras and sonar and sediment kits and temperature sensors and global positioning system logs and the works. And I met them at the trailhead limping slightly and led them to the river. And when Claire stood beneath the bridge, she looked over the concrete supports and the current flow and the shadow the span cast across the water, while her graduate students were already placing cameras beneath the pilings. And after 20 minutes of silence, she turned to me, stating, "You said they claimed you were blocking migration," and I confirmed that's the story. And she said, almost laughing, "Well, you're Bry. DG does the opposite." And I raised an eyebrow, asking how so, and she pointed toward the underside of the structure, explaining, "See the way the current slows here as the bridge creates small refuge pockets, which are micro-habitats and juveniles use that as resting zones during seasonal movement, and the shade keeps the water temperature down, which is critical for survival in late summer." So I asked if it helps the fish, and she said it helps the fish, and if anything, tearing this bridge down would do more harm, and that felt good to hear, really good. But it got better, because while her team worked, one of the graduate students walked over, looking troubled, saying, "You might want to see this." And he led me 50 yards downriver onto the homeowners association side, where I saw it immediately with fresh tree stumps, not old and not naturally fallen, but cut clean and deliberate. And I asked what the hell, and the student pointed with a measuring stick explaining, someone's been clearing riparian vegetation, probably to improve their view, and riparian zones are protected by both county and state law. And I asked if that was legal, but I already knew the answer, and the student said no, and cutting this close to the water increases sediment runoff, which is bad for eggs and bad for juveniles and bad for everything. And I felt anger rise in my chest again, but this time hotter and steadier, because the homeowners association had accused my bridge of harming wildlife while they were illegally cutting riverside trees for better picnic views, and hypocrisy didn't even begin to cover it. So Claire documented everything, including global positioning system coordinates and drone footage and sediment samples and stump cores and erosion markers, and by the time they left, she handed me a preliminary written statement with her conclusion being blunt, stating no obstruction detected in bridge supports, beneficial microhabitats, and observe vegetation removal on opposite bank, which may indicate the environmental violations by adjacent property owners. And I shook her hand saying, Claire, you just handed me dynamite. And she smiled, replying, no, I handed you the truth, so use it. And as their truck drove off, I looked back at the river and at my bridge, standing solid and calm, and at the homeowners association carved up riverbank because they wanted to use science as a weapon, which was fine, except they forgot something important that science fights back, and this time it was fighting for me. And 3 days passed after Claire's visit without a single homeowners association letter showing up in my mailbox, with no threats and no accusations and no new fabricated maps. Just silence, and silence from people like Karen is never peace, but rather silence means planning. So I prepared by installing 2 new trail cameras, with one angled toward the approach to the bridge and another hidden deep in the brush across the river, featuring infrared and night vision and motion-triggered capability tied to a backup memory card buried in a waterproof pipe 6 feet away, because if the homeowners association wanted to escalate, I would be ready. And on the 4th morning before sunrise, something woke me. Not a noise, but a feeling. Specifically tension in the air that a man learns to respect after 60 years of storms and engines and human nature. So I got up and slipped into my boots and put on my coat and followed the path to the river, and halfway down I heard it, which was metal on metal, sharp and intentional, not the river and not the wind and not an accident. And I stepped through the trees and froze because 2 men in reflective vests were crouched at the base of my bridge, with one wielding a socket wrench and the other using a cordless drill to loosen the guardrail bolts, and parked behind them was a white van painted with blue letters reading Riverside Tranquility Maintenance Division, representing a fake division for a fake justification behind a very real crime. And I didn't shout, but rather raised my phone and hit record, and walked out of the tree line like a man already holding the winning hand, saying, "Morning, boys." And the one with the drill jerked upright while the other stopped mid-turn with wrench frozen in his hand, and the first man stammered, We're with the homeowners association, and we've been contracted to begin structural removal of this. But I cut in, stepping closer, stating this is my bridge on my land, and what you're doing is felony property damage. And he swallowed hard, saying, "We have authority." And I asked from who, and he hesitated, then pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper, which was a memo signed by Karen B., not notarized and not stamped and not legal in any universe. And when I kept filming, panic flickered across both their faces, and I said, "You boys realize this could put you in prison, right?" And the shorter one's voice cracked, saying, "We're just doing what she told us." So I dialed the sheriff's office and stated, "I have 2 individuals attempting to dismantle certified infrastructure on private property, and I have full video." And the dispatcher confirmed deputies are en route. And the men didn't run, but the real crack came 30 seconds later, when the taller man exhaled shakily, with shoulders collapsing inward before slowly holding out his phone toward me, saying, "Look, just so. You know we didn't come up with this." And on the screen was a text thread from a number saved as Karen B. Homeowners Association, and the messages were unmistakable, asking, "Is it done yet? And make sure you remove the main support bolts so the structure fails completely, and cash is in the usual spot." And another bubble stated, don't let him see anything and do it before sunrise. And finally, if the sheriff asks, say it's homeowners association property and stick to that. And I didn't speak, but just let the camera roll. And when the deputies arrived, the men didn't argue and didn't deny a thing as they handed over the memo and handed over their tools, and the phone, which was the real treasure, went straight into Deputy Thurman's evidence bag. And Thurman looked at me with jaw tight and eyes sharp, saying, "This is a whole different level." And I said quietly, "No, this is exactly what they've been aiming for." And he nodded grimly, stating we're placing them under arrest for trespassing and attempted destruction of private infrastructure. And as the men were led to the cruiser, the shorter one broke, saying she paid us to do it with cash, and she said the bridge was illegal and she needed it gone before the county inspector came. And Thurman turned back to me, asking, "Garrett, between those texts and your video, this is going to explode." And I said, "Oh, I know." And he asked if I was planning to sue. And I said, "Planning as deputy, I've already started." And he let out a low whistle, stating, "Well, good luck, though it looks like luck won't be the deciding factor here." And when they drove away, leaving tire tracks carved deep into the frosted dirt, I stood alone at the entrance to my bridge, with the sun rising behind me, turning the river gold, representing a new day and a turning point. And I looked at the barricade and the drilled bolts and the fresh scratches on my concrete, then whispered, "Karen, you just handed me the case of a lifetime, and after the arrest, things went quiet again. Not peaceful quiet, but not the kind of quiet that comes from wind through spruce branches or river drift over stones. No, this was homeowners association. Quiet meaning calculated and coiled and waiting, because Karen had taken a swing at my bridge and missed, and people like her don't retreat after one mistake as they double down and triple down and eventually implode under their own arrogance. So instead of waiting for the next blow, I decided to give her something to swing at, specifically a decoy, a lure, a big, stupid, obvious, irresistible piece of bait that she could not help but attack, which would be a fake bridge, not a real structure, and not Eve. And remotely convincing to a sane human, but just convincing enough to fool a homeowners association drunk on its own self-importance. So I called two old contractor buddies from my engineering days who were men who appreciated a good joke and hated bureaucratic nonsense almost as much as I did, and one of them asked, "You want us to build what?" And I corrected, stating, "Not build, but assemble, and think of it as an art installation," and they laughed, saying, "Now you're speaking our language." So we bought hollow polyvinyl chloride pipes and leftover 2x4 lumber and 3 plastic barrels and fluorescent orange tape and rebar scraps and a gallon of concrete-colored paint, and within 6 hours, we created the most ridiculous bridge Montana had ever seen, specifically a wobbly pink and gray contraption that sagged if you breathed too hard near it, and we set it over a narrow section of the public buffer zone, which was technically nobody's land, but close enough to the homeowners association trail that Karen would see it and lose her mind on sight. And we even added a sign, freshly laminated reading site of proposed bridge access project under review permit pending Montana Civil Route Division, and the permit number was something I invented on the spot, reading number RN0FK. And my contractor buddies nearly passed out laughing, with one saying, "This is going to hook her so fast she won't know." She swallowed the bait, and I replied, "That's the plan." So we left the whole thing standing like a monument to stupidity, and then we waited. And we didn't wait long, because 4 days later, at exactly 9:12 in the morning, 2 sheriff's deputies knocked on my door, with one saying, "Mr. Kane," already looking exhausted, and stating, "We received a complaint from Riverside Tranquility Homeowners Association that you've begun unauthorized construction of a second bridge." And I gave him my most innocent look, asking, "A second bridge where?" And the Homeowners Association says you built a structure downstream. And I said, "Oh, you mean the exhibit?" And he blinked, asking the what. And I stated the exhibit, which is an artistic commentary on the illusion of shared jurisdiction in rural Montana, built with no foundations and no footings and no structural intent whatsoever. And both deputies stared at me for a long second before the younger one asked, "So it's not a bridge?" And I replied, "As real as their land claims." And the older deputy coughed to hide a laugh, stating, "Well, nothing illegal here, as they'll have to take it up with the county's art commission, I guess." And they left shaking their heads, but I knew Karen wasn't done. And the next morning, another envelope arrived with Homeowners Association letterhead, dripping with indignation, stating cease and desist order for illegal structural activity adjacent to homeowners association property, and you are hereby instructed to remove the unauthorized access platform and cease all construction immediately. And I could barely finish reading it before handing it to Mitchell, who nearly fell out of his chair laughing and said, "We'll respond formally and thoroughly and with the full weight of your environmental report attached." And we did, by sending them a letter titled "Regarding the Artistic Structure Mistaken for Infrastructure," and inside we included photos showing polyvinyl chloride pipes and plastic barrels, and proof the site wasn't on homeowners association land, and documentation of riparian violations on their side, and the environmental report stating that my bridge was beneficial to wildlife. And the next part I couldn't have planned better if I tried, because 3 days later a reporter from the regional newspaper called saying someone inside the homeowners association had leaked the entire complaint thread, and the story hit the Sunday edition, and it spread fast, with Reddit grabbing it, then Facebook, then TikTok, then some college kid made a meme comparing Karen to a medieval warlord besieging a playground. Own toy, and within 48 hours the homeowners association Google listing was renamed Riverside Tranquility Guardians of Imaginary Infrastructure, and I didn't change it, but I enjoyed it, and suddenly neighbors who had never spoken to me before were waving from their porches, laughing and shaking their heads, with one shouting from across the river, asking, "Is that you, the guy with the art bridge?" And I raised my coffee mug, replying guilty, but beneath all the humor and all the memes and all the sarcastic articles, something else was happening, because Karen was becoming cornered and embarrassed and humiliated and increasingly unstable, and people like her don't collapse gracefully as they lash out, and when they do, that's when they make their biggest mistakes, specifically the kind of mistakes you win lawsuits with. And the fallout from the polyvinyl chloride bridge war spread faster than spring runoff, with homeowners association members furious, not at me but at Karen, as meetings turned hostile with memos leaked and rumors spread, and some residents even started a petition to remove her, though nobody wanted to be the first signature on it because fear still lived there. But fear makes people predictable, and predictable people make dangerous decisions. And 4 days after the meme storm peaked, I got a knock on my door, not from deputies or neighbors, but from a courier who handed me a thick envelope stamped with a seal meant to look official, except he didn't realize I had spent 40 years reading actual official documents, and this was not one. And inside was a formal notice of boundary violation from the county engineering office, or so it claimed, including a revised survey overlay showing my bridge crossing into homeowners association land, and a safety condemnation recommendation signed by an engineer, and an urgent notice demanding my bridge be removed within 14 days, and if the envelope were any thicker, it would have needed a spine, so Mitchell arrived. Ed 40 minutes later, holding his own copy, and he set it on my dining table and said one word, being Garrett, and I looked up, and he said, "This is fiction, specifically bad fiction," and we combed through it page by page, with the problems jumping out instantly. And first, the engineer who signed it was Leonard Briggs, the same name from the fake safety closure memo, and Mitchell tapped the page saying check his license number, so I looked it up on the state registry and discovered revoked 5 years ago, with reason being submitting falsified soil tests on a highway expansion contract. And I almost laughed because Karen hired a disgraced fraud to forge engineering letters, and Mitchell folded his arms, stating she hired a disgraced fraud who isn't legally allowed to call himself an engineer, and we kept going with second issue, being the logos were wrong, with font slightly off and spacing inconsistent because a county office doesn't use a pixelated seal, and third, the parcel numbers didn't exist, as Mitchell checked the geographic information system lookup stating they made up land parcels out of thin air, and I said not even thin air, but stupid air, and fourth, the survey lines use the wrong datum set because you don't use an urban grid system on a rural topographic map, as only amateurs or desperate people make that mistake, and Mitchell sighed, stating, "This is criminal territory now, with multiple counts," and he placed a hand on the stack saying, "Garrett, get ready because she's about to do something even dumber." And he was right, because that afternoon I received an email from the Department of Environmental Quality containing a new complaint filed anonymously but citing community concern and alleging water contamination and bridge caused siltation and disruption of native wildlife and erosion due to private construction interference, representing a laundry list of scare words copied straight from environmental law blogs. But here's the thing, that Claire's team had already documented the exact opposite, so I forwarded everything to her, and her reply came back in minutes stating, "I'll write a formal counter report, and also this level of false reporting can carry its own penalties." And penalties was a word that felt good. But the real showstopper came the next morning when the survey crew arrived, being two older men in heavy jackets with global positioning system rigs strapped to their packs, and the leader looked familiar, and I said, "Milton Hughes." And he grinned, saying, "You didn't tell me you were this Garrett Kane." And Milton had been one of my professors decades ago, specifically one of the men who taught me load distribution and soil density long before homeowners associations were even words in my vocabulary. And I said, "You're the one who helped me file the original topographic survey." And he replied, "I still got a copy, and it still matches the county archive." And he and his partner, Wayne, who was a retired state boundary specialist, spent the whole day scanning every square foot from my property line to the homeowners association edge, including every coordinate and every marker and every historical overlay. And by sundown, they had their result, with Milton holding up his tablet stating, "Garrett, your bridge is 100% on your land with no overlap, not even an inch." And Wayne chimed in stating, "And the homeowners association land Karen keeps referencing isn't even registered to them at all, as it's a natural easement, which is unclaimed buffer, meaning they tried to assert control over something they don't own." And Mitchell arrived just as we were packing up, and Milton looked at him asking if he's the lawyer, and Mitchell confirmed yes, and Milton said, "Tell your friend here something for me," and Mitchell said, "Go ahead." And Milton tapped the forged survey in the earlier packet, explaining they not only used the wrong datum set, but they used the wrong decade of maps. And Mitchell raised an eyebrow asking meaning, and Milton said meaning they didn't even bother forging it. Well, because this is amateur hour fraud. And we all stood there for a moment, including me and Mitchell and Milton and Wayne, with the icy Montana wind blowing off the river, representing four grown men realizing the full stupidity of one homeowners association president. And Mitchell clapped his gloves together, stating, "Well, this settles phase one." And I asked, "What's phase two?" And he smiled, saying, "Criminal filings." And I looked back at my bridge, being the same bridge Karen had tried to condemn and block and sabotage and seize, where sunlight caught its concrete railings while the river whispered under it like nothing had happened. And I took a long breath, muttering, I guess Karen really thought she could out-engineer an engineer. And Mitchell said, "Oh, she thought much worse, as she thought nobody would check her work." And he picked up the packet of forged documents, stating, "Well, tomorrow morning, a judge is going to check it." And the courtroom felt warmer than I expected, not because of the temperature, but because of the people, where every pew was filled with some faces curious and some anxious and some entertained, and a few reporters sat in the back row with notebooks ready, like they knew history was about to be made. And Karen sat across the room at the defense table with chin lifted and blazer crisp and eyes hardened, while her lawyer looked far less confident, as if he knew the ship had a hole in it but couldn't find the bucket. And Mitchell leaned toward me asking if I was ready, and I said, "I've been ready since the day they chained my bridge." And when the judge entered, the room fell silent, and Mitchell began his opening, being measured and calm and sharp enough to cut steel, as he explained that this wasn't a simple property disagreement, but a deliberate campaign of fraud and harassment and forgery and trespass and sabotage, engineered and executed by the Riverside Tranquility Homeowners Association under the direction of its president, Karen Brooks. And he mentioned forged engineering letters and fabricated maps and illegal safety notices and false environmental complaints. And his words lingered, stating a coordinated attempt to dismantle a structurally sound bridge on private land. And Karen stiffened while her lawyer shifted in his seat. And when their side responded, it was with brittle confidence, as the Homeowners Association attorney insisted everything had been done in the interest of community safety, and that they believed the bridge unsafe and unlawful and environmentally harmful. And it might have sounded convincing if you'd never seen what they'd actually done. But Karen couldn't help herself, as she leaned into her microphone and added, "We only acted responsibly, and we never damaged anything." and we never touched his bridge. And Mitchell smiled the way a hunter smiles when the deer steps into the clearing, and he approached the witness stand asking Mrs. Brooks to confirm, "You are stating you never instructed anyone to physically interfere with Mr. Kane's bridge." And she straightened, saying, "Absolutely not and never." And Mitchell nodded as though he appreciated her confidence. Then he looked up at the judge requesting, "May we dim the lights?" And the courtroom darkened, and Mitchell tapped his keyboard, and a video flickered to life on the projector. Were there for everyone to see were two men in reflective vests at the base of my bridge, with one loosening bolts and the other drilling into the guardrail, and my voice echoed in the room calm and steady as I had filmed it. And then came the sound bite that froze the air being, "She paid us to do it with cash, and she said the bridge was illegal." And Karen jerked forward in her seat, and Mitchell paused the video at the perfect frame with both workers clearly visible asking, "Mrs. Brooks, would you like to correct your answer?" And the room buzzed with whispers, and Karen's lawyer reached for her arm, but she pulled away, stammering, "I don't know those men." And Mitchell didn't argue because he didn't need to, as he simply lifted a clear plastic evidence bag containing a phone the deputies had seized, stating, "Your Honor, these are the text messages recovered from one of the workers," and he read them aloud with each word representing a hammer striking the coffin closed, including, "Is it done yet? And make sure you remove the main support bolt so the structure fails completely, and cash is in the usual spot, and don't let him see anything, and do it before sunrise. And if the sheriff asks, say it's homeowners association property and stick to that." And Karen sagged in her chair as the courtroom gasped, while her lawyer closed his eyes with shoulders sinking, and even the judge let out a long, controlled breath. But Mitchell wasn't done as he moved to the forged engineering reports, being the ones signed by engineer Leonard Briggs, stating, "Your Honor, Mr. Briggs's license was revoked 5 years ago, and he is not legally allowed to sign engineering documents, yet these letters were used by the Homeowners Association to condemn Mr. Kane's bridge." And Karen tried again to interject, but her lawyer whispered urgently, "Stop talking," but she didn't, as she said, "That's not my fault, he told me." And Mitchell cut her off with perfect timing, asking, "So you admit contacting Mr. Briggs for engineering work?" And her mouth snapped shut, and the judge looked exhausted already. And next came the environmental testimony, where Claire stepped forward with her calm scientific certainty and systematically dismantled the Homeowners Association complaints, as she explained that my bridge created beneficial microhabitats and that fish used its shaded currents as rest zones, and that the real ecological damage came from the Homeowners Association illegal clearing of vegetation due windstream. And she ended with a line that echoed through the room, stating if this Homeowners Association had succeeded in removing that bridge, the river would be worse for it, not better. And by then, Karen's lawyer wasn't even taking notes anymore, as he just stared at the table in front of him as if hoping a sinkhole would open and swallow him whole. And at last, all testimony concluded, and the judge folded his hands and stared long and hard at Karen, stating, "In all my years on the bench, I have never seen a homeowners association act with this level of deceit, because you falsified documents and you interfered with private infrastructure and you endangered a homeowner and you attempted to manipulate government agencies using fabricated evidence." And he issued the ruling that the Homeowners Association would pay $280,000 in damages and fees and restitution, while Karen personally owed $75,000 in fines, and she was banned from serving on any Homeowners Association board in the state, and the fraudulent engineer and 2 Homeowners Association board members would face criminal investigation, and the boundary survey was declared final, with my bridge being fully and unquestionably and legally on my land. And then he looked at me stating, "Mr. Caney, this court grants you permanent injunctive protection, and the Homeowners Association may not interfere with your property again in any manner, and this matter is closed." And I nodded with no smile and no celebration, just quiet, steady relief, because justice, I've learned, doesn't shout, but rather stands upright and speaks plainly and lets the truth do the heavy lifting. And that day, truth buried the Homeowners Association, and snow began falling the week after the verdict, being soft at first and drifting slowly through the treetops, then thickening into that kind of heavy Montana snowfall that blankets the world in quiet, and the valley looked peaceful again. Being peaceful, in a way, it hadn't felt for months, and my bridge stood exactly where it always had, being strong as the day we poured the concrete and glistening under a thin sheet of early winter ice with no chains and no barricades and no cameras and no drill marks from desperate midnight sabotage, but just a bridge, specifically my bridge, leading to my home. And I walked out to it that morning with coffee steaming in the cold and the air sharp enough to wake every part of the soul, and the river rolled quietly under the forming ice crust, being slow and steady and unchanged by all the noise humans had tried to throw at it. And funny thing about nature is it doesn't care about homeowners association drama, as it just keeps moving. And I leaned on the railing, listening to the water whisper beneath the stone, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't listening for trouble, but was just listening. And behind me, the crunch of footsteps in the snow made me turn, where a pair of hikers came down the public trail, bundled in thick jackets with trekking poles, tapping the frozen ground. And as they drew closer, one slowed and squinted, then grinned, asking, "Wait, are you that guy?" And I raised an eyebrow, asking which guy. And he said the bridge guy, and the homeowners association war guy, because I saw it all in the paper. And man, that was wild. And I gave a small laugh, saying, "Yeah, I guess that was me." And he gave me a thumbs up before jogging to catch up with his partner. And as they disappeared along the river trail, I realized something strange, being that people weren't avoiding me anymore, and they weren't afraid of Karen's gossip or her threats or her letters, because the spell she held over Riverside tranquility was broken, and fear only works when people believe you have power, and Karen had none left. And Mitchell called that afternoon to inform me that 2 homeowners association board members had resigned, and another was cooperating with investigators, and rumor had it Karen had sold her house at a loss and left town, headed west to stay with a sister in Oregon. And I didn't celebrate, and I didn't wish her harm, but I just felt finished, because some battles aren't about revenge, but rather they're about setting things right and letting the dust settle. And settling is exactly what the town began to do. And a week later, the county posted an official notice online clarifying that all unplatted buffer zones, including the one Karen tried to claim, were legally off limits to homeowners associations. And quietly, almost without fanfare, my bridge became the reference point for future boundary surveys along the Black Row River, representing a landmark and a line in the sand, and something that wasn't moving no matter how hard someone pushed it. And I figured that deserved a marker. So on a cold, bright morning, I mixed a batch of concrete in a wheelbarrow and hauled it to the bridge entrance and set a post. And when the base hardened, I bolted a solid steel frame sign onto it, being simple and clean and nothing fancy. And it read, "This bridge is built on private land and shall not pass." And below that, on a small bronze plate I ordered from a local craftsman, I added "dedicated to peaceful water and quiet mornings and fish who mind their own business," representing a little humor for the next hiker who stopped to read it. And as I tightened the final bolt, another neighbor from across the valley passed by on the trail, and he paused and admired the sign and let out a quiet chuckle, stating, "Well, that ought to settle it." And I answered it better, and he shook his head, saying, "Crazy what they tried to do to you." And I didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. And when he was gone, I walked back onto the bridge with boots crunching softly on the frost, and snow had begun falling again, being big flakes drifting down like someone was trying to tuck the world under a blanket. And I stood there for a long while, thinking about everything that had happened, including the forged maps, and the fake engineer, and the sabotage, and the lies, and the court, and the verdict. And somehow, standing there with snowflakes melting in my beard, none of it felt heavy anymore, because the river kept moving, and the mountains kept watching, and the land was still mine. And not just because a judge had said so, but because I fought for it, and because I refused to be bullied off what I built, and because some things in life are worth more than convenience, and worth more than quiet, and worth more than avoiding trouble, as some things are worth defending. And my bridge was one of them, while my home was another. And that night, I grilled a steak and poured a glass of the apology whiskey one of the former homeowners association board members had mailed me with no note, just the bottle. And I sat on my porch while the snowfall thickened around the valley, and the bridge was just visible through the dark, being a quiet silhouette against the white and solid and untouched and exactly where it belonged. And as the snow settled on the rails and the river whispered under the ice, I realized, something being that the war was over and the river had its calm back, and so did I.